In 1867, a French photographer named Charles Marville was commissioned by the city of Paris to document its streets before Baron Haussmann's renovations began. What he captured became one of the most extensive photographic surveys of a major European capital ever attempted. The images are technically remarkable. They show wide boulevards, ornate facades, detailed street lamps, intricate cobblestone patterns. But there's something else in these photographs. Something that appears in image after image. The streets are empty. Not just quiet. Empty. Marville photographed over 500 locations across Paris between 1865 and 1868. In the vast majority of these images, no people appear. No carriages. No street vendors. No crowds. Just architecture and infrastructure, perfectly lit and entirely vacant. The official explanation is simple. Early photography required long exposure times. Moving objects created blur, so photographers waited for streets to clear, or they shot early in the morning when foot traffic was minimal. This is documented. It's reasonable. It's been the standard explanation for over a century. But when you examine the breadth of Marville's work, the timing becomes harder to explain. He photographed central Paris, the busiest arrondissements, major intersections, commercial districts, markets, and in photograph after photograph, the streets remain empty. Not blurred. Not partially occupied. Empty. The exposure times for wet collodion plates in the 1860s ranged from 2 to 20 seconds depending on light conditions. A person standing still for 10 seconds would appear. A slow-moving cart would leave some trace. But in hundreds of images, the streets show no activity at all. Marville wasn't alone. In London, photographers like Henry Dixon and Alfred Brothers were documenting the city's expansion during the same period. The Society for Photographing Relics of Old London employed multiple photographers between 1875 and 1886 to record buildings before demolition. Their archives contain thousands of images. And the pattern repeats. Street after street. District after district. Infrastructure without inhabitants. The photographs show gas lamps, drainage grates, newly paved roads, fresh construction. They show systems designed for density. But the density isn't visible. This is presented as a documentary exploration of photographic records, architectural history, and infrastructure development. What follows examines timing, scale, and pattern, not as evidence of fabrication, but as observations that invite further examination of how we interpret historical photography and urban development. In New York, the same phenomenon appears. Photographer Berenice Abbott's Changing New York project in the 1930s deliberately captured empty streets for artistic effect. But earlier work from the 1870s and 1880s shows similar emptiness without that intention. Images of Broadway, of the Brooklyn Bridge under construction, of tenement districts, all featuring infrastructure at scale with minimal human presence. The bridges are there. The buildings are there. The streetcar rails are there. But the people using them are largely absent from the frame. The technical explanation holds for individual images. A photographer waits for a clear moment, shoots during off hours, chooses angles that minimize movement. But when this pattern appears across multiple cities, multiple photographers, and multiple decades, the explanation requires consistency that's difficult to verify. How often were major urban streets actually empty enough to photograph? How many attempts did each image require? How much coordination was needed to clear intersections in cities with populations exceeding 500,000? There's a second element that complicates the standard explanation: the infrastructure itself. In Marville's Paris photographs, the streets aren't just empty, they're remarkably finished. Curbs are clean. Cobblestones are precisely laid. Street lamps are evenly spaced and uniform in design. Drainage systems are visible and appear newly installed. The infrastructure doesn't look worn or adapted over time. It looks complete, purpose-built, designed for a level of use that isn't yet present in the frame. The same observation applies to Dixon's London work. His photographs of the Thames Embankment, completed in 1870, show engineering at a scale that seems disproportionate to the foot traffic visible in surrounding images. The embankment was massive. It required moving 3.5 million cubic yards of earth, installing a new sewer system, and building a raised roadway with gardens. The project took 7 years. When photographed shortly after completion, it appears pristine and largely unused. This isn't evidence of absence. It's evidence of presence, of infrastructure, without corresponding evidence of the demand that typically precedes such investment. The pattern extends beyond Europe and North America. Photographs of Calcutta from the 1860s, taken by Samuel Bourne and others, show colonial infrastructure on a metropolitan scale. Wide roads, multi-story administrative buildings, organized street grids. And again, the images capture architecture more often than activity. The buildings suggest thousands of workers. The streets suggest daily commerce. But the photographs often show neither. In Melbourne, Australia, similar documentation exists. The city grew rapidly after the gold rushes of the 1850s, and photographers like Charles Nettleton captured its expansion. By the 1870s, Melbourne had grand civic buildings, organized boulevards, and extensive rail infrastructure. The photographs show this clearly. What they show less clearly is the gradual accumulation you'd expect from rapid growth. The infrastructure appears coordinated, planned at scale, executed with consistency. The timing raises questions that the technical explanation alone doesn't fully address. If exposure times made it necessary to photograph empty streets, why was so much infrastructure already in place when these photographs were taken? Why do the streets look finished rather than under construction? Why does the architectural consistency span such large areas? These aren't accusations. They're observations about what the images actually show versus what we assume they represent. And there's one more detail that threads through these collections: the light. Early photography was light-dependent. Wet collodion plates required strong, even illumination. Most photographers worked during midday or early afternoon when shadows were shortest. This is when urban streets would typically be most active. Markets open, shops conducting business, workers moving between sites. Yet the photographs consistently show these peak hours as empty. The light is perfect. The shadows confirm the time of day. But the expected activity is missing. This creates a friction between what we know about urban life in the 19th century and what the photographic record actually preserves. Written accounts describe crowded streets, congestion, noise, competition for space. But when we look at the visual evidence from the same period, we see the infrastructure itself tells a different story than the emptiness around it. Take the Erie Canal. Construction began in 1817 and was completed in 1825. It stretched 363 miles across New York State, connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie. The engineering was extraordinary for its time: 83 locks, 18 aqueducts, and excavation through terrain that had never been surveyed at that scale. But here's what stands out: the canal was built before the population existed to justify it. In 1820, the entire state of New York had a population of roughly 1.4 million people. Most were clustered around New York City and the Hudson Valley. The western regions where the canal was being built were sparsely populated. There were no major cities along the route. No industrial centers demanding connection. No existing trade volume that required a 363-mile waterway. The canal wasn't built to meet demand. It was built in anticipation of demand that hadn't yet materialized. And yet, when it opened, the infrastructure was complete. Not provisional. Not expandable in phases. Complete. The locks were uniform. The width was standardized. The engineering specifications were consistent across the entire length. This suggests centralized planning and execution at a scale that seems disproportionate to the population and economic activity of the region at the time. The same pattern appears in Britain's railway expansion. Between 1830 and 1850, over 6,000 miles of railway track were laid across England, Scotland, and Wales. The projects were massive. They required tunnels through mountains, viaducts over valleys, and stations built to accommodate thousands of passengers. Many of these stations were completed before the towns around them had populations large enough to fill them. The station at St. Pancras in London is a clear example. Construction finished in 1868. The train shed was the largest single-span structure in the world at the time, 240 feet wide and 100 feet high. It was designed to handle enormous volumes of passenger and freight traffic. But when it opened, the surrounding neighborhood of King's Cross was still largely industrial and underdeveloped. The station wasn't built for the London that existed in 1868. It was built for a London that would emerge decades later. This isn't unusual in isolation. Cities plan ahead. Infrastructure anticipates growth. But the scale and consistency of this pattern across Britain, across the United States, and across other industrializing regions during the same narrow period is striking. It suggests coordination. Not necessarily conspiratorial coordination, but organizational capacity that seems difficult to reconcile with the fragmented, localized economies of the early 19th century. Consider urban water systems. In the 1840s and 1850s, major cities began installing centralized water infrastructure. London's Metropolitan Commission of Sewers was established in 1848. New York's Croton Aqueduct opened in 1842. Paris began modernizing its water supply in the 1850s under Haussmann. These weren't small projects. They required engineering expertise, massive labor forces, and financial investment at levels that typically only emerged during wartime mobilization. The Croton Aqueduct alone was 41 miles long. It included tunnels, bridges, and a distributing reservoir that held 20 million gallons. The project took 5 years and cost over $9 million, an astronomical sum in 1842. New York's population at the time was about 300,000 people. The aqueduct was designed to serve a city of over 1 million. It was built for a future that hadn't arrived yet. But it wasn't just the scale. It was the standardization. When you examine photographs and engineering records from this period, the infrastructure shows remarkable consistency. Gas lamp designs were uniform across entire cities. Streetcar rails were laid to standard gauges. Building facades followed repeating patterns. Administrative buildings, post offices, customs houses, courthouses, appeared in city after city with nearly identical architectural language. Neoclassical columns, symmetrical layouts, grand entrances, precise stonework. This suggests more than local initiative. It suggests templates, shared standards, a level of institutional coordination that's difficult to trace in conventional historical records. In the United States, this becomes particularly visible in the years following 1816. That year is often called the year without a summer. A volcanic eruption in Indonesia caused global climate disruption. Crops failed. Temperatures dropped. Famine spread across Europe and North America. By all accounts, it was a period of crisis. And yet, within a decade, some of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in American history were underway. The Erie Canal began in 1817. The national road expansion accelerated in the 1820s. State capitals and federal buildings were constructed across newly admitted states. The timing feels compressed. Crisis, followed immediately by coordinated expansion at a scale that seems to require the very resources that had just been depleted. Britain experienced something similar. The Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815. The country was financially exhausted. The national debt had tripled. Demobilized soldiers flooded the labor market. Social unrest was widespread. And then, within 15 years, the railway boom began. Not gradually, not tentatively. With an intensity that transformed the entire landscape of Britain in less than 2 decades. The financial mechanisms behind this expansion are documented. Joint stock companies, parliamentary acts, private investment. But the speed and scale still feel disproportionate to the economic conditions of the time. It's as if the infrastructure was already planned, already designed, and simply waiting for implementation. There's another detail that threads through these projects: storage capacity. Warehouses, granaries, and freight depots were built alongside railways and canals, often before the goods existed to fill them. The Liverpool docks, expanded throughout the 1840s, included warehouses capable of storing millions of pounds of cargo. The volume of trade didn't match that capacity until decades later. The same pattern appears in New York, in Hamburg, in Marseille. storage built for futures that hadn't yet arrived. And then there's the administrative infrastructure. Census records from the 19th century become suddenly detailed after 1800. Birth certificates, property records, and tax documentation appear with increasing standardization. Government offices multiply. Bureaucratic systems expand. This is typically explained as the natural growth of modern state capacity. But the consistency across different nations with different political systems, during the same narrow window, suggests something more coordinated than parallel evolution. Whether this reflects inheritance, convergence, or something else entirely, the pattern remains. Infrastructure appearing at scale, designed for populations and economic activity that hadn't yet materialized, implemented with a consistency that spans regions and borders. The photographs capture this. Streets empty of people but full of systems. Not because the people didn't exist, but because the photograph preserves a moment when the infrastructure was complete and the density it was designed for hadn't yet arrived. Or perhaps because the density had existed differently. Or because the term Tartaria appears on European maps beginning in the 13th century. It referred to the vast territories of Central Asia controlled by various Turkic and Mongol groups. The name derives from Tatar, a confederation of tribes that dominated the region for centuries. By the 18th century, cartographers used Tartaria loosely to describe areas that were poorly understood or difficult to classify, a label for geographical ambiguity more than political reality. In recent years, the term has been reinterpreted. Not as a geographical designation, but as a framework for examining infrastructure and architectural patterns that seem difficult to explain through conventional historical narratives. The empty street photographs fit into this reinterpretation. They become evidence not of photographic limitations, but of timing mismatches. Of systems appearing before the conditions that would justify them. Three interpretations emerge from this examination. The first suggests administrative continuity. That 19th century infrastructure projects inherited plans, standards, and organizational frameworks from earlier periods. That the consistency we see across regions reflects shared institutional knowledge rather than independent development. Under this view, the empty streets capture a transition moment, when inherited infrastructure was being documented before new populations filled it. The second interpretation focuses on economic anticipation. That industrial and financial systems in the early 19th century were sophisticated enough to plan at scales that seemed disproportionate to contemporary conditions. That the infrastructure wasn't built for existing demand, but as speculative investment in futures that financiers believed were inevitable. The empty streets, then, show the gap between construction and occupation, between capacity and use. The third interpretation questions the timeline itself. It suggests that our understanding of 19th century population distribution, economic activity, and urban density may be incomplete. That the photographic record preserves something we haven't fully accounted for, not absence but a different kind of presence. Not emptiness but a pattern of use we can no longer recognize. None of these interpretations requires conspiracy. None demands erasure or suppression. They simply ask whether the standard explanations fully account for what the evidence shows. Return to 1816, the year without a summer. Climate disruption, crop failure, social crisis, and then almost immediately expansion. Not recovery, expansion. Infrastructure projects that required enormous resources, technical expertise, and coordinated planning. This isn't impossible. It's just compressed. The timeline feels dense in ways that invite examination. The photographs preserve this compression. They show finished systems in moments of apparent non-use. Not because use didn't exist, but because the photographic medium captured infrastructure more reliably than it captured activity. What we're left with is a record that emphasizes scale over density, architecture over inhabitants, systems over the people who operated them. The label Tartaria has become shorthand for this unease. It doesn't claim to be a lost empire or a hidden civilization. It functions as a conceptual placeholder, a way of naming the friction between what we expect 19th century cities to look like and what the photographic record actually preserves. A way of asking whether the infrastructure we see in these images aligns with the historical narratives we've constructed around them. The evidence invites examination. The streets are empty, but the systems are complete. The timing is compressed, but the documentation is consistent. The explanations are reasonable, but the pattern is persistent. What the photographs ultimately preserve is a question about scale and sequence, about whether infrastructure always follows demand, or whether it sometimes precedes it in ways we haven't fully mapped, about whether the emptiness in these images reflects technical limitation, or whether it captures something else, a moment when systems existed at scales their surroundings hadn't yet grown into. The streets remain empty in the frame. The infrastructure remains present. And the distance between those two facts, between capacity and occupation, between construction and use, remains a space where observation meets interpretation, where documentation meets uncertainty, and where the historical record asks more questions than it answers.